Thank you very much for coming. Today we're going to listen to a talk about aetosaurs, those weird shelled or carapaced archosauromorphs from the Triassic that are seldom found in southern Africa, but are abundant where our speaker comes from. So our speaker today is Professor Andy Heckert from the Department of Geology and Environmental Sciences at the Appalachian State University in Boone, North Carolina. And so we had the pleasure to have Professor Heckert for a field trip in the Triassic of the Elliott Formation. And he was very keen on sharing all his knowledge about archosaurs, and today he's going to again share his knowledge about the aetosaurs. You're currently working with us at the U.S.A. on the Driefontein collection, right? Yep. With John Hancox and Jonas Schwanier. And so, yes, today he's going to talk about the aetosaur, those mysterious aetosaurs. Thank you, Andy.
Thank you, Julian. Thanks, everybody. Thank you very much for having me. I'm going to try to get this chair away. Something terrible happens. Okay, so yeah, before there were ankylosaurs, there were aetosaurs. But the way I like to think about it here is, oh yeah, thank you. Oh, that's so much better. So when we're talking about convergent evolution, right, there were aetosaurs long before there were ankylosaurs. So they explored this armored quadrupedal archosaurian type niche long before there were ankylosaurs. So the talk I'm going to talk to you about a variety of different things that I've been involved with over the years. So essentially none of it is just my work. There's a huge number of people that I've collaborated with in the past who've let me into museums, who have funded my work. Where I did a lot of my work in New Mexico, U.S.A., there's a huge volunteer corps that is instrumental in collecting and preparing fossils and so on. So, so there's a set of acknowledgments to people to whom I am deeply indebted. And then particularly, why is Heckert in South Africa? I was able to obtain Fulbright support. So I'm on what's called the Global Scholar Awards, and there's a Flex Award. And certainly, I think the U.S.A, you guys could definitely attract additional workers to come in, because my particular award requires that you visit 2 places in 2 different regions to study whatever it is you're studying. And since Triassic workers study fossils from Pangea, is sort of a no-brainer. It's not really hard to come up with groups that come in different places. And they also have various awards for both students and scholars to come to the United States. So I would encourage people to explore that. And basically what they've done is they've enabled me to miss a semester of teaching and come here to study, as I said, the Driefontein fossils found by John Hancox and so on. But since you guys have the Driefontein fossils, and maybe next year we can try to give you guys a little more detail on that, because I should be able to come back again next year. Instead, I was going to talk about aetosaurs, which these are sort of, honestly, aetosaurs began as my hobby animal. I came from a university that didn't have the kinds of classes you guys have. We didn't have so many classes on form and function and classes really aimed at vertebrate paleontologists. So we were sort of a learn by doing. There was stuff in the collection and you just started working on it. My advisor, Spencer Lucas, was like, oh, here's some aetosaur osteoderms we borrowed from the University of Michigan. We should describe them. Okay, so this basically began as something to do while I was trying to build a microvertebrate collection for my master's thesis and PhD. So yeah, aetosaurs, very strange animals. They are archosaurs. They are on the crocodile line. They're fairly early on the crocodile line. We'll show you that more in a few minutes. And basically, they have this ridiculously short skull, and the thing that really characterizes them and makes them relatively abundant in the fossil record, at least in the basins where they do show up, is this extensive armor, these osteoderms that minimally are essentially 4 columns that parallel the spine, and some of them even have much more than that, okay? And so one of the ongoing themes of Triassic research, especially on the Archosaur lines, in the last decade or so has been that, I mean, we kind of always knew, right? There's been organisms in the water. There's been vertebrates in the water that mimic or have the ecological niche that crocodilians have now. Phytosaurs and various of the archosauromorphs and archosauriforms had this sort of semi-aquatic predator niche. But you know, the more we get into, or the more we improve the Triassic fossil record, we see all sorts of different things happening in the Triassic that people normally associate with dinosaurs or crocodilians or other things like this. We've got dome-headed animals now. There's even horned archosauromorphs. There's sail-backed archosauromorphs. There's all kinds of different things. So within that, we've actually known about aetosaurs for almost 200 years, 150 years of decent scientific knowledge of aetosaurs, and yet we still don't know near as much as maybe we could or should. Okay, so, I mean, obviously they're fairly convergent with ankylosaurs. They're very heavily armored. They're very spinosed. This is an aetosaur, and incidentally, if you have Legos, they're a wonderful thing to throw in your museum study kit. They're European, they're centimeters, so you can instantly see that this is, you know, this piece is less than 10 centimeters tall. This, unfortunately, doesn't have a scale, but I could barely hold it, you know, about that big. But this is the neck ring of an ankylosaur from New Mexico. But I mean, there's only so many kind of solutions. And then, yeah, we were just talking about at lunch about this very strange animal that just came out, the strange ankylosaur. There's actually an outgroup to aetosaurs. There's an animal called Euskolasuchus, which actually looks kind of similar to that. So a lot of things that happen later in the Mesozoic, you can actually find kind of more portable versions of them in the Triassic. Overall, the aetosaurs, there's give or take 25 known genera that, you know, more or less 30 or so species, and that's, as you can see, has increased even since the last major review, which I was a part of in 2013. And I actually have mainly worked on their armor. I have not actually done a huge amount of work myself on their skulls. The armor is abundant, widespread, it's relatively accessible. There are relatively few skulls, but I would argue that if you look at this, I mean, for an animal that's a group of animals only known for about 30 million years, there's a fair amount of diversity in this clade. They're not, clearly not all doing the same thing. Later on, I'll maybe try and convince you that we're really not sure what they were doing, but they're doing different things. That's a fair amount of diversity in the skull morphotypes. One contribution we've tried to make is trying to codify the osteoderm descriptions a little bit. They were sort of called paramedians, which are the two that run down the axis of the spine, and lots of archosaurs have those. And then these ones next to them were called laterals. And anytime you get into an animal which has tons and tons of these armor, people started calling everything rows. So one thing we tried to do is say, hey, folks, why don't we standardize this? And let's call the ones that parallel the vertebral column columns, and the ones that go transversely, let's call them rows. And with most aetosaurs, they seem to correspond almost one-to-one to the vertebrae, so that each vertebra has 2 paramedians and 2 laterals associated with it. Many, but not all aetosaurs also have a ventral carapace that's often not as well known or described. And then many, but again, not all of them, have a heavy coating of appendicular osteoderms, small osteoderms all over the limbs. In older literature, these were often called scutes, but of course the scute is just the keratinous covering for the bony part, so osteoderm is really the better term. And when you start thinking about this, 4 columns, 50 plus vertebrae in the column. That's 200 osteoderms off the bat there. And then you start adding in ventrals and appendiculars. There's a lot of potential elements to enter the fossil record that are fairly robust, and at least you wouldn't think be scavenged or anything like that. In a general sense, we see there are some very wide-bodied aetosaurs. There are many that are actually very spinose, that have their osteoderms have elongated spines off of them. And there's a fair number of them that retain sort of this plesiomorphic pattern of just sort of 2 columns each of laterals and paramedians and relatively gracile, comparatively, animals. So where do they fit on the tree? They are one of the more early diverging on the Pseudosuchian line. I really prefer Kurotarsan, but whatever. They're one of the most early branching groups on the so-called crop lineage. Okay, they're in the groups that many years ago were just sort of known as thecodonts, but now, of course, we have a much better understanding of the sort of early Archosaur evolution. And there's been a lot of work recently on their immediate outgroups. So depending on where phytosaurs lie, and that's a whole nother talk, but phytosaurs are usually either even more basal to aetosaurs or else just outside of Archosauria. And then the aetosaurs are one of the earliest Pseudosuchian branches to diverge. And just recently, there have been a series of animals, Caenosuchus, which was long thought to be an aetosaur, Euskolasuchus, which was long thought to be very strange, and Revoltosaurus, which was originally thought to be an ornithischian until Parker and colleagues found complete skeletons. And we now know that those animals are immediate outgroups to aetosaurs, although this is still a little bit puzzling, challenging, because all these things show up in the late Triassic, and so there's not very much known as far as what the aetosaur antecedent might be. Phylogeny in flux, the intergroup relationships. This, and if I was going to throw one up, I'd throw one that Devin Hoffman conducted, because he was a student of mine and is now a PhD student at Virginia Tech. And so we have phylogenies of them, but we don't fully understand very well, in part because a lot of animals are known primarily from their osteoderms. Only a few are known from well-preserved skulls. And so there's a great deal of non-overlap in some of these taxa that make it relatively challenging to understand what's going on. You see that no real clade is really, truly, supremely well supported, but they are clearly a monophyletic group. Okay, so again, we have sort of spinos aetosaurs, and some of those definitely cluster as a clade, desmatosukines. There's a type of thoracine, or sort of a wide-bodied clade. And then the more plesiomorphic taxa are sort of found throughout the tree. So, as I alluded to earlier, they are solely known from sediments of late Triassic age. There are no pre-late Triassic aetosaurs. And over the course of my career, the late Triassic has gotten a lot longer. I think when I was an undergraduate, the late Triassic was about 225 to 208, and now we're down to 237 and up to about 201. So this is a big block of time that these animals existed on the planet, and yet they sort of really just kind of show up. So we definitely need to learn more about them from Middle Triassic rocks. We do not know enough about their antecedents. The other thing I'd say is that, so I just threw up on the top of the phylogeny. There's not a good time-calibrated phylogeny. But, so up there on the top, I just have N's for Norian, C for Carnian, R for Retian. As best we can tell, tying non-marine strata to the marine timescale is challenging. But fundamentally, the point to get out of that is that very early on, there are representatives of derived lineages. So we know there must have been a fair amount of activity, evolutionary activity, occurring somewhere here in the Middle Triassic. These animals when they first show up, they've already diversified, and it doesn't really matter whose tree you use. everybody's tree shows fairly derived taxa showing up early on. Probably they are most common, the best known, most diverse, bulk of the diversity is Norian. They appear to go extinct at the Triassic-Jurassic boundary, or at least there's none that are at all close to the Jurassic. The record in the Retian, or so-called Retian, is pretty minimal. So while there are no Jurassic aetosaurs, I wouldn't just unambiguously argue that they died right at the Triassic-Jurassic boundary. I think they were fading out a little before then. And of course, they lived on Pangaea and are known from almost all upper Triassic strata in Pangaea, except of course southern Africa for some reason. They have not yet been found in southern Africa. They ought to be in the lower Elliott Formation. There's no real reason why they shouldn't be, but yet they have not made their appearance there yet. So that is a source of great frustration. I mean, they're in India, they're in Italy, they're in Morocco, Argentina, Brazil, of course the United States, there's aetosaurs in Greenland, Germany, so on. And so if Listersaurus could wander around all of Pangaea, you would think that some aetosaur somewhere would have been motivated to get into southern Africa, but to date that has not happened. Any presentation I feel should kind of give you, the journalistic questions: who, what, when, where, how, why of aetosaurs. I'm kind of hoping that a lot of this is novel to you guys because aetosaurs are not a thing that are found in South Africa. And they actually, I mean, while not maybe being the focus of any one real major paleontologist research, they have a pretty illustrious history as far as paleontologists that have worked on it. Louis Agassiz was the first scientist to describe an aetosaur, although he was under the impression it was from the old red sandstone. So he described it as a fish because he thought it was Devonian strata. A mildly famous fellow named Huxley then realized it was from the new red sandstone and correctly identified it as closely related to crocodilians, or at least far more closely to crocodilians than to placoderms. Famous American paleontologists Cope and Marsh of the dinosaur bone wars of the 19th century actually each touched upon aetosaurs. Again, not a major part of their feud, but they did, at least each of them have named aetosaurs. And then these two Germans, the Frost, father and son team, they worked on aetosaurs from Germany, and this is arguably the most spectacular aetosaur specimen known in the world. This is parts of 22 to 24 articulated skeletons that were found in a building stone quarry in Germany in the late 19th century. It's truly a spectacular specimen. The bad news is it was found in the 19th century, so it was prepared by hand, not under microscopes and not with modern adhesives. So honestly, it actually kind of looks a little better from further away than it does when you get up close, because a lot of things were just, it was not easy for them to save it. It's still spectacular, and there's a lithograph that they made of it that is just truly stunning. And studying that block has been one of the funner things in my career, because if you ever get a chance to travel to Stuttgart and study in the collections, they're amazing. Okay, so they pulled that block off exhibit for me, and for a week, this is my desk and that block, and so this is my office. And as the distortion tells you, that's a panorama of their collection. So there's huge oversized racking behind me. And this is really just ichthyosaurs. Okay, I mean, only about a half dozen of them are pregnant with embryos in them. The rest of them are just kind of normal ichthyosaurs. Okay, and if you go way down to the end of this hallway down here, you see this thing kind of, I don't know what it's doing there really, but that's a full-size reconstruction of the mouth of Carcharicles meganon, the giant, the biggest shark. Okay, so it's way down there. The opposite wall on the other side is full of plesiosaurs and pliosaurs and things like that. Just enormous collections. So, I mean, really a fun place to be able to sit and work. Otherwise, in the early 20th century, of course, you can't talk about Triassic reptiles without talking about von Huene, who did work some on aetosaurs, including those German ones. There was a fellow named Case, Erman Cowles Case, who collected them from primarily Texas. He worked for the University of Michigan Museum of Paleontology. Joe Gregory held positions at Yale and at Berkeley, and he collected some aetosaurs. But Alec Walker is probably the most important contributor, sort of the mid-20th century. He worked on aetosaur fossils from Scotland and really produced the first real monograph that comes close to a modern understanding of them. And you can see that basically his reconstructions from 1961 are essentially the basis from which everybody else works nowadays. And of course, he's famous for some other Tarson work. So 1985 was a really big turning point in aetosaur studies. Up until then, vertebrate paleontology in the United States, there never been very many workers in the Triassic at any one time. And Rob Long and Karen Ballou had this big collection that the University of California, Berkeley had made in Petrified Forest National Park, Arizona. And it had dozens to hundreds of osteoderms. And they started really looking at them, and they're saying, you know, there's real differences between these different osteoderms. And so they just kind of made, this is classic 1980s, they made a table of what the different differences were. Well, for somebody like me as a graduate student, I was in graduate school not too long after this, and this was also just the beginning of doing cladistic analyses. And so something like that is hugely tempting, right? Because you can turn a table of characteristics like that into a bunch of zeros and ones, or zeros, ones, and twos, or whatever. And it caused people to really start going back and looking through their collections and seeing that, hey, there really are dramatic differences between some of the osteoderms. Those are paramedians. The laterals are especially distinct. And therefore, a fair number of taxa were actually described just on osteoderms. And so what I'm trying to show with this graph is that basically the yellow stars were all already known in 1985. But so anything that doesn't have a yellow star was named since then. So you can see that we've basically doubled the aetosaur diversity in the intervening years, in part because of this understanding that their osteoderms are distinct. So there's really not been a lot of paleobiology per se done on aetosaurs, right? They're not dinosaurs. A lot of the specimens are fairly fragmentary, and they're not necessarily easy to work off of. I mean, they're on the crocodile line, but they're so physically distant from what modern crocodiles look like that there's not really good candidates for analogs. People thought like maybe anteaters, armadillos, it's not really clear. So what I want to kind of show is just several different things about them that we do think we know, or that we think people should be working on. They're part of the group, Thecodontia, of course, is paraphyletic, but quote unquote Thecodonts leave quote unquote chirothere-like tracks, and aetosaurs in particular leave these tracks called brachychirotherium. And this had been hypothesized for a while, but I was fortunate enough that on the last day of a dig one year, a woman asked my best volunteer, she's like, well, how did you find what we were digging up this trip? And he's like, well, you walk around like this and you look around a little bit, oh, hey, there's some bone. And a year later, we had collected this animal. A couple years later, it was prepared out. It was, it's an almost complete skeleton minus the skull. But the really nice thing is, even though this thing is completely articulated, and it does lack hands, which was disappointing, but the feet are kind of preserved flip-flop so that you get to see one in palmar view and one in dorsal view, right? So you get to see kind of palmar plantar views of these feet. And so between that and we became aware of some articulated specimens at Harvard, and we were able to show that, yeah, these things really do. They have dinky front feet, larger back feet, and they are more what we would call mesaxonic, which is that instead of having the more primitive archosauromorph pattern of very long external digits, or internal digits, 1, 2, and 3, the axis of the foot has moved from from those interior digits to being more medial. And these things have a relatively narrow pace. So Matt Selesky, who's done a lot of artwork for me over the years, a colleague of mine, took our reconstructed skeleton and shows how it would leave the kind of the trackways that we see associated with Brachychirotherium. Oddly, some Rawasuchians may also leave Brachychirotherium-like trackways, but certainly some of them at least were made by aetosaurs. Because it's really unclear what these animals were doing, a lot of people have postulated, or were they digging? Were they some sort of scratch digging? This has not been evaluated too rigorously in any real way. I mean, basically, we have argued, there's a lot of things which are kind of generally associated with digging animals, and aetosaur skeletons seem to have some of those, but not near all of them. This fellow, I don't know how to pronounce his name, but Drodz in Poland, he did a really nice article on the hand of aetosaurs, and so it looks like at least some of them were at least digging fairly regularly. Their snouts, their skulls are very strange. I mean, they're clearly not predaceous in the sense that they're not chasing down other tetrapods in any meaningful way. If you zoom in on them, they have a reduced dentition. There's almost none of the anterior part of the snout. The teeth they do have are generally pretty typical pathetic archosaurian teeth. They're not, they have no real specializations. And a lot of times they even kind of look carnivorous, even though you can't believe that an animal like this was chasing anything down. So we really don't know exactly what they're doing. There's been a lot of arguments that maybe they were grubbing, maybe they were digging up insect nests and things like that. So maybe they were sort of omnivorous or insectivorous, but certainly with this array of skulls, there's room for a lot of them to be doing a lot of different things. And whatever they were doing, they did it for the better part of 30 million years. So even though they don't look optimal for any one thing, they obviously were reasonably successful. Some other paleobiological things, I mean, when we find them, when we do find articulated specimens, that's kind of good news and bad news. The good news is you've got an articulated specimen. The bad news is it's completely covered in armor, which then makes it very hard to evaluate the rest of the skeleton other than the armor. However, because they are so thoroughly encased in armor, this is a specimen from Argentina that we just finally finished the manuscript to. You can do a little bit more biology with them than you might with any other animal. They preserve cloacal vents. Osteologically, all we can really say about the cloacal vent for most archosaurs is that it should be at the end of the ischia. Okay, that's the osteological correlate of the cloacal vent. Well, aetosaurs having so much armor on them, it's a weird thing to become specialized on, but after you start describing a few specimens, you end up with multiple ones that have various, so Walker had done this in 1961. So fundamentally, you see there's a variety of quote unquote strategies here for this. And of course, my favorite is actually from that articulated skeleton of Typhothorax. If we zoom back to that one, when it got fully prepped out, and I was able to come back to that museum and visit it in Mexico, and we started looking, we saw all these spinose osteoderms. And I happened to know, well, it didn't happen, I mean, I knew full well, we had a cast of another nearly complete skeleton of this animal. And once I saw that these were spiky osteoderms were around the cloaca, I was like, I got to go look at that cast, and I am so hoping it doesn't have them. Okay, I was just like, please, please, please do not have spiky osteoderms, because then we've surely got sexual dimorphism. I mean, these two skeletons stratigraphically equivalent. Everything else, I ran over to the other side, it had them. So, so I don't know what that means. I mean, at a certain level, maybe it explains the extinction of Typhothorax, because it's just weird. But it does give you some insight into what they're doing. And it is kind of an interesting thing that a lot of them, the tail area is pretty bulgy and robust. And so, I mean, we have not yet found aetosaur eggs. There's one putative report of an aetosaur nest from Italy, but illustrations are unconvincing. So we really don't know much at all about their reproductive biology. But there's another cool thing about this specimen in Argentina that I thought very interesting. So you can see here's our two columns. We have two columns of ventral paramedian osteoderms. And then, I don't know, this is about 16 rows back from the pelvis. They're fused together, okay, into a single, paired osteoderm, okay? And people who have done histology work on aetosaurs. I've done very little. But the osteoderms, generally it's clear if you look at the lines of arrested growth, if you look at the lags, they grow outward from what's called the center of ossification, which is almost always some sort of knob or boss or some sort of fairly robust point. Okay, so that what you get is that you will get lags here as you move out from the center on osteoderms that preserve the lags. Okay, well that's very interesting. We have historically, aetosaur taxonomists, we have used the patterns in those osteoderms to differentiate taxa using a bunch of, kind of a talking about things having random pitting or radial pitting or things like that. Well, if you really look at the patterns in detail, and this is the holotype of Aetosauroides from Argentina, okay, so head at the top, tail at the bottom, and you really look at its osteoderms, they actually have a variety of patterns. They're all radial in this, to the extent that there's sort of, things emanate from that boss, or that center of ossification. But the wide ones have really elongate ridges. And the narrower ones have what Taborda called an anastomosing pattern. And that's a really good term, is instead of looking at the grooves, look at the ridges. The ridges anastomose. So that starts to tell you that maybe a big chunk of that pattern is really just how is the animal growing. Okay, and this is testable. Sadly not in South Africa because you guys don't have more aetosaurs, but I mean, but we can slice and dice up some of those aetosaurs and maybe say something about that. So, okay. And indeed, some of the specimens that I've worked on actually shed light onto this and some of the other functions, okay? So where I come from in North Carolina in the USA, we don't have beautiful outcrops. We are buried under vegetation and subdivisions, but we do have brick quarries where they have dug out the sediment, and the sediments we have are extremely thick. They're from the Newark supergroup. So this is the rifting of Pangea. And so basically it's like the East African rift, but 200 some million years ago. And so you have great big block fault basins. You have a mountain here, you have a valley there. You're pouring sediment into them, okay? So since I've moved to North Carolina, we've had the good fortune to find a few different specimens. My colleague Vince Schneider came up with the name for this one, Gorget asucus. So my understanding is that Gorget is the French term for this medieval collar of armor. And so this is the neck armored crocodile from the Pekin Formation, and that new ankylosaur, actually, they're using a similar term or base root of their genus. Okay, when that thing was shown to me, it was in a block of rock about the size of American football, so smaller than a rugby ball. And it was just a ball of sandstone and armor. And I told Vince, oh, that's really neat. I knew about this other complete skeleton we'd found. I'd looked at a bunch of issues. So I was like, oh, you got a bunch of tail vertebrae or tail armor plates. And so that was kind of cool. It's worth prepping out, though. I would come down to the museum every time, and he'd have a few more osteoderms prepped out. And once he had them completely prepped out, we realized it was actually a very spiny aetosaur, far spinier than we thought it was. And even though this is the entirety of the specimen, about 20 osteoderms, we could show that it was distinct from Longosuchus and Leucosuchus both, two other taxa known from the region from the time. It's actually a distinct aetosaur, just based solely on the neck armor. And from that neck armor, we could also argue that it was pretty close to Desmatosuchus, and I'll show you a reconstruction here in a minute. There was another smaller specimen. This one is only about this big, and it's the anterior part of a carapace. And so we were able to describe that specimen too as a new species of Colomosuchus. Note how very, very wide proportionally these osteoderms are. We did CT scan it. We were hoping to get more because, again, I felt like this would be a really neat project for, to essentially undress one of these animals, right? Take the armor off and see what the skeleton looks like inside it. The problem with these Newark supergroup sediments, they've been deeply buried, they're loaded with hematite, and so that while Devin was able to follow a few elements in and get a little bit more out, they're just not amenable to that, so somebody else will have to do that. Okay, but we were able to section a few osteoderms, and generally speaking, what various aetosaur workers have shown is that by and large, aetosaurs are relatively slow growing. Okay, they're not particularly large animals, and the biggest ones, a few meters in length, might have 20 lags. So they were taking, it was taking them 20 years to get to a fairly good body size. What we found in this holotype, so here are essentially three specimens that are all about the same age, same size, I'm sorry. They're all broadly equivalent in size to each other. Two from Argentina and the North American one. And you can see that this one has just a few lags, it's thought to be 6-ish years old. This one is similar size, maybe a little wider, but 10 years old. And then we could only find a couple of lags at all in this specimen, which was wider than either of them. So it seemed to indicate that this animal is growing faster. And if we go back to my armor plates, okay, so this is one of the most radial osteoderms on that 6-year-old, okay, broadest, most radial. And Colomosuchus, one of the things that kind of defines it is that it has very, very, very fine pitting, so it really just doesn't even hardly show up. But it's basically a series of just subparallel grooves. This thing is, and it appears now that that's partly because it's growing extremely rapidly, which may mean, unfortunately, that Colomosuchus may just be a juvenile of something else. Or really, that's an alarming possibility, is that some of these osteoderm characters, it's not terribly surprising, right? Osteoderms can be fairly plastic in their growth, but it might be a little unnerving if we suddenly start collapsing some of these genera because of their growth patterns. Some other fun things, this Paratypothorax specimen in Germany, they mounted it on sort of a sculpture. It's kind of an interesting thing. That was another kind of fun thing to work on. And then one of my colleagues in my department, Lauren Waterworth, not a paleontologist, but she's very artistic, and she pointed out to me, I'm at a university, I don't have an exhibits department, I'm not in a museum. And she's like, yeah, but we have an art department. And she had a friend, Travis Donovan, who teaches sculpture there. So we were able to collaborate with Celeste. He gave us a drawing of Witwatersrand. The art students turned it into a 3D model, did a bunch of CAD work, and created this metal frame with, that's actually insulating foam, mixed up their own plasticine, and made a full-scale model of what an aetosaur should look like, or what we think Witwatersrand in particular looked like. And we were successful enough with that we were then able to approach a bunch of private donors. We more or less auctioned the thing off. So we got an environmental company to sponsor the skull, an oil and gas company to sponsor the hind limbs, a guy for that company got the forelimbs, and we actually had individual sponsors for osteoderm rows. So we were able to eventually collect enough money. So this got, unfortunately, we've never been able to dedicate it. It was delivered like 2 weeks after the pandemic started. So it's just kind of sitting out there. I mean, we're using it or whatnot, but we haven't been able to have a social thing for it. So hopefully then, you can now answer the journalistic questions of who, what, when, where, how, why aetosaurs, right? There's this late Triassic crocodile line. We have a lot of fossils, but we really don't know that much about their paleobiology, I think, even though they have a 30 million year career and we have a lot of different fossils. And so there's opportunities to do a lot of different things with these guys. And I keep trying to remind the ankylosaur workers about these guys because I think there's some very interesting convergences there that people might be interested in further exploring. So thank you much for your attention. I appreciate it. This is what Archie looked like before he got turned into bronze, our Gorgetta supus, and I guess I'm happy to answer any questions.